Hello everyone, I am Mostafa Menessy, co-founder and CTO at PayMob. So I'm going to talk about today about combating payments fraud First of all, I would like to thank Arab Security Consultant for having me this year. It's a pleasure. Let me give context before starting. So basically, here at PayMob, we're kind of offering digital payment methods or payment solutions to multiple stakeholders, either the banks or the merchants or the telecom operators. We do have multiple payment solutions. Like, for example, there is what we call the acceptance solution, that it is basically targeted for the merchants to be able to help the merchants collecting digital payments through their customers. We do have other solutions, like, for example, the mobile wallets that we're offering for the banks and operators. So I'm going to discuss today in a specific point in our fintech industry. I'm going to share that with you today, which is basically how to combat the payments fraud in the fintech or the payments industry. So nowadays, no one is doubting about the ongoing growth of the non-cash or the digital transactions around the world. So it has proved that it's way better to conduct digital payments versus the traditional kind of payment cash collection, because of the benefits that it does have. Like, for example, the speed of the transaction, there is the better convenience, there is the part that is related to avoiding carrying cash or helping avoiding bribery, and so either you are an end user, you are a merchant, you are a business owner, you are even a governmental agency, digital payments has proved that it's the best or the preferred solution when it comes to kind of performing transactions between different stakeholders. So to give you a kind of a quick glimpse about the ongoing digital transactions that it is being witnessed around the world. So in 2016, for example, there were around $482 billion of the transactions that happened digitally. And digitally meaning that it's not only specific to the card transactions, but there is for example, the mobile wallet transactions that are in place. There are some bank transfers, etc. So there are multiple payment channels or digital payment methods that are involved to help kind of revolutionize the payment terms or the payment means that we're having currently. Fast forward to 2021, we're witnessing almost by the end of the year, it is forecasted that it will pass over 876, or approximately close by 900 billion. And that amount by itself, it's ridiculously big, and it's only going to increase. It doesn't show any kind of signs that it stopped to decrease. Like, based on the statistics, there is ongoing year-over-year growth of the digital transactions around the world of around 12%. So that by itself it's a big number if we factor in the numbers year by year basis. But then, with the nature of every kind of technological revolution, there are some challenges that arise based on that evolution. And one of the most critical and most challenging aspects, of course, is fraud. So it's a big chunk of the game that all of us as stakeholders need to take into consideration for helping in the growth of such transactions and help combating the fraud. So to give you also a glimpse about the numbers, so if we're comparing, for example, from around 12 years ago, in 2009, to 2018. In 2018 alone, there were around 28 billion of losses because of the fraud, and that's of course as well, it's a big number to consider. While in the forecasts are saying that between 2021 till 2025, it is expected that such fraud losses could sum up to 206 billion. So definitely there must be a solution. Definitely we shouldn't lose the game against the fraudsters or against the criminals for that. And in order to start analyzing and see where the problem is, we need to first analyze the artifacts or the current situation. Like, for example, back in 2009, there are certain fraud types that happen. So 61% of those fraud types, it happened because of the online fraud. So this is called the remote purchase transactions, or the card not present, also known as CNP transactions. And the following highest tier, it falls down to the counterfeit card, which is basically the clone cards that exist, or the spoofed cards that exist in the market. And then follows that, there is the lost and stolen cards, there is the card identity theft, there is the attacks that are related to the cards that are not being active. So all of them contribute, but we need to focus on the majority of where the fraud is happening, which is actually the 61% back in 2009. Fast forward to 2008, there are some interesting analysis or conclusions that appeared, which is the online fraud cases increased to 76, while for the counterfeit card, it decreased to almost 2%, which is very interesting. And the reason for that is that back in 2009, there were the adoption of the magnetic strip cards was widely used in US, for example, and other markets. Till I think it was till 2020, till 2012. Back then, there were some kind of enforcement to switch to the chip and pin kind of transactions, and accordingly, such type of fraud decreased dramatically because of the security that is involved in the chip-based transactions that it offers against the magnetic strip, which is very easy to clone by using some cheap devices that is able to clone the track 1 and track 2 and track 3 data, and after copying it, cloning it into another card. So that type of attack, it's no longer the case, and it become very, very minimal because of the currently wide adoption of the chip and pin, which proved that it would be a significant kind of an improvement. So what's got the conclusion out of this? Basically, the conclusion out of this is that still we do have major problems when it comes to the online fraud. So I have seen that in the poll that was done, most of you guys have chosen the online fraud, which is fine, which is the right answer. So actually, this is where we should all focus on. So before diving into the details of the fraud types exactly and how to make the proper security measurements for each and every them, we need to know how the payment flow works. So for example, me or you as an end user would go to a certain retailer, and then after buying the purchase, after buying a certain good, you present the card to the merchant, and then the merchant would take that card and then puts it in the POS machine, and then the POS machine would send such transaction back to the what's called the merchant gateway, and through that merchant gateway it is sent to the acquiring bank, which is the bank which is considered to be the bank of the merchant. And then afterwards the acquiring bank would be able through the card networks, either Visa, MasterCard, or any other card brand, would be able to identify who's the issuer bank, or who's the bank that printed that card of the end user. Is it, for example, bank X, or is it bank Y? In order for him to transfer or to route the traffic of that card to the issuer bank and check accordingly if you do have enough balance in your card, and in case so, the money would be deducted from your bank, and accordingly the issuer bank would notify the card network, and then the card network from its part would send back to the acquirer bank saying that the money has been successfully deducted from the issuer card, and then the acquiring bank would credit that money back to the merchant's bank account. And then accordingly the merchant would get the notification along with the cardholder through an SMS or some kind of a notification. So as you can see here, there are multiple stakeholders involved, and there is definitely an interest for the fraudster to kind of take advantage of that, of the difference of or the different level of the fraudsters, or of the payment flow, in order to kind of know exactly. So if you think about it, what can potentially go wrong? Well, obviously the attacker is very interested in the card holders, since this is the eventual goal, is to kind of steal the card credentials. But then if you think about it, the attacker would be very interested as well in the merchant itself, because for him the merchant, it's kind of one-stop shop from which, if he kind of gained access to the POS or the merchant devices, like for example through inserting a keylogger or so not only he would be able to target a specific card holder, but he can gain access to all of the informations that is passing through that merchant. And this is what happened, for example, again in US, for example, in the big retailer group like Target and so, there were massive breaches where some attackers managed to insert some keyloggers on some POS devices and managed to extract a massive number of card credentials. So this is the second interesting attack surface for the fraudster to kind of penetrate into. Likewise, also for the merchant gateway, it is very interesting for the fraudster. Likewise for the issuer bank, likewise for the acquirer bank. So if you think about it, there are multiple attack vectors depending on each and every type or the position of the stakeholders that exist in the full payment flow. And each of these attack vectors is totally different from the other attack vectors. Like for example, if you want to target a specific card holder, the techniques that you're doing, it's totally different from the techniques that the fraudster would do against attacking the issuing bank or the acquirer bank or the merchant gateway, etc. So jumping into the specifics in terms of the types of the fraud cases or the common fraud types that occur in the market, you can consider them as being like the WASP top 10 common web vulnerabilities. So these are the common fraud types or the common fraud attacks that occur in the market. So there is what's called the bin attacks. There is the ASI attacks. There is the account takeover. There is the cash out transactions or refund transaction fraud or attacks. There is the merchant identity fraud, and each of them, as I said previously, each of them tackles a specific stakeholder at a different position. So to start with, for the bin attack. So the bin attack primarily it targets the issuer bank, and the end users eventually, since the eventual target for any kind of attack for the fraudster is to understand or to get the card credentials of the end users and conduct, of course, the transactions. So what happens is that basically certain fraudster would try to kind of enumerate all the possible combinations of a certain scheme or a certain card details. But if you think about it initially, you say that in order for you to get the card credentials or to brute force actually the card credentials, there is of course the 16 PAN digits, there is the expiry dates, there is the CVV. So how on earth can you kind of brute force this and come up with a valid card without using any kind of quantum computing even or so? And even if it's quantum computing, still it's a challenging problem. So so the thing is that it is a bit predictable because there is a scheme around it. If you kind of analyze the card PAN, which is the primary account number that represents the 16 digits of the card, you have the first digit, which represents the card brand, that is either Visa, MasterCard, GCB, Maestro. The most commonly used, of course, is the MasterCard and Visa. And then accordingly, in the first 6 numbers, it represents the BIN. So BIN, you can consider it as the bank identification number of the bank itself. So it's the ID of the bank that the bank does have in order to issue card. Consider it as the address of the bank. So this is very predictable, and this is common. Let's say if you're dealing with bank access, so for each card that is being issued from that bank, it should have the same kind of bank BIN number. And then follows the first 6 digits. There is what's called the account ID, which is almost 9 digits. And then afterwards, there is the checksum, which is based on some algorithm called the Lin algorithm. Basically, it's like the MD5 hash, where you have a certain kind of number or a string, and you want to check if those kind of strings make sense. So there would be some checksum. So accordingly, it would be appended, and of course, it's predictable once you have the first 15 digits. So if you think about it, there are actually only 9 digits that represents your ID. The problem relies in some banks. Unfortunately, those 9 digits are not 9 digits. It boils down to 5 or even less, because due to some misconfigurations, some banks, for example, do have the first 5 digits of those 9s are predictable as well, or are common across multiple card batches. So that's why when it comes to the BIN attack, the overall, the attacker or the fraudster is trying to understand the behavior or the methodology from which the issuer bank is generating that number in order to get the proper PAN. And out of that proper PAN, still he would be able, he should be having the expiry date and the CVV, of course. And for that, there are some further attacks that are done in order to get those kind of details. Like, for example, for the month and year for the expiration date, usually in average, for the card, for any card that is issued, maximum there is a number of years of 5 years from the point of issuance to the point of expiry. So the attacker would try to kind of try all possible combinations from the month he's trying to the brute forcing attack till 5 years, and that represents almost 60 possibilities. So it's not that huge, of course. And then accordingly, if the attacker managed to get the expiry details, so he would be so close to kind of getting the final detail, which is the CVV. So that's in general when it comes to the bin attack. For the ASI attack, which is an abbreviation of the account status inquiry attack. So that attack basically the fraudster does use it for kind of checking the validity of that card. And the way it is done, basically, the fraudster would attempt to try to do a transaction yet with zero amount. And that's very interesting for the attacker, since usually those type of transactions are not flagged in any type of fraud solutions or fraud detection algorithms. They bypass such fraud tools, and that's what the attacker want actually, is to kind of test or validate the card before conducting any transaction, in order not to kind of fire, let's say, a transaction with $2, and then afterwards he will conduct another transaction with much bigger number. So this attack would help the fraudster into kind of testing without going in the radar of the fraud tools that exist on the different stakeholder. Well, for the third type of attack, there is what's called on how to hijack your account. And by hijacking your account, he implicitly would have access to your card through, for example, buying certain goods or conducting certain purchases on that store. So he can use multiple techniques, like, for example, phishing, keylogging. He may even attack the website in order to kind of extract the users. So such an attack, again, it's not to directly steal the card credentials, rather than take advantage of the account that is controlling that type of card. And it is posing definitely a huge impact on the industry as well. Well, for by extracting the OTP and the card credentials, and then afterwards they would conduct certain transaction on the e-commerce, or even conduct what's called an account value load on a certain wallets, and based on that they could cash out that transaction from ATMs. So the problem is that with that type of fraud, would directly gain money through the card that he or she is trying to steal, by doing the account value load on some wallets, or even conducting some purchase transaction on merchant, and trying to kind of refund that transaction after it happened through a cash mean. legit in order to kind of collect the card credentials, and as soon as such card is inserted into the POS, it would be sent back to the merchant CNC server, or the merchant fraud server, to be able to conduct further analysis or abuse such details. And mitigations. There is the basic conventional fraud detection and alerting solution, which is basically responsible for kind of analyzing or detecting the certain parameters of the transactions, and based on the rules that are provided in the system, the fraud solution would either pass or reject the transaction. So the rules that would play a role into either blocking or accepting the transactions are based on, for example, would be based on the card ban. Like, for example, if the card is stolen, the card is suspicious, for example. Tens of minutes. So that's basically very important, as the time narrows between the transaction, there is a probability that it would be some kind of an automated script that is trying to kind of identify, let's say, the card details and so. So it has, of course, its pros and cons. It's very the pros of it. It's very strong implement. It requires some custom rules based on the, let's say, on the amount of the transactions. In case the amount of transactions exceeds a certain limits, then automatically the transactions would get declined, or either based on the as I said, based on the IP, in case the transaction that is incoming is from a suspicious IP, from Tor exit node, for example, or a proxy, or some kind of a like suspicious highly suspicious country. So in that case, the transactions would be blocked. So the cons of it is as follows. So once the attacker knows about such type of granularity of rules, he would try to evade it. So let's say, for example, after, let's say, 5 attempts, there is a block on the IP. So the attacker would then understand that he should be having, let's say, multiple IP pools in order to conduct such attack, and he would try for each and every IP only 4 attempts, not 5 attempts, in order not to block himself from the system. So it's kind of predictable when it comes to how to counter attack from the fraudster perspective, how to counter attack such a defensive solution. And of course, it requires an analyst in order to kind of iterate over the transactions on a daily basis, and seeing what are the transactions that make sense to be considered or to be categorized as fraudulent transactions, and accordingly conduct and apply for them some rules. and for the transactions that seem malicious but not really malicious, or in actual form it is not. It is what's considered a false positive. So it requires an expert in that part to be able to kind of reach to the most optimal true positive kind of matrix when it comes to the fraud detection solution. So this is the first type of fraud solution. The second type is the merchant machine learning fraud detection solution. So as you may all know, machine learning has become a vital part in each and every kind of a solution nowadays when it comes to technology. And so far it has played a very important part as well when it comes to fraud into detection. So what it does basically is that you supply for the machine learning model a certain supervised data or labeled data saying that there are certain transactions that conducted fraud, and there are certain other transactions that are benign, and based on that the machine learning algorithm would figure it out through generating the model for it. So the good thing about it, basically, it is working on a big scale very well, unlike the original type of fraud solution, and it doesn't require any kind of senior expertise when it comes to configuring that solution, because basically it learns from the past history of the behavior of the fraudsters based on the parameters that are given of the transactions, like the IPs, the time of the transactions, the merchant category code, the transaction velocity, the email of the user, all of these kind of, and the behavior of the user as well over the merchant website, and all of these kind of data parameters are sent to the machine learning fraud solution. From its part, basically it tells us either that type of transaction is fraudulent and or not, and this happens through what's called the it does some kind of a transaction risk score modeling. So for each and every transaction, it says that there is a probability that this transaction is very or it does have a very high risk. So if we assume that there is a scale from 0 to 100, where 100, for example, is the highest risk kind of transaction, so it helps in identifying or giving a score for each and every transaction. And in case, let's say, the transaction had a certain value of 90, so in case so it is very risky, and it is categorized as rejected accordingly transaction. So that's when it comes to the machine learning fraud detection solution. Of course, one of its cons, it's still the false positive rate. It's a bit in the wild. So to kind of circumvent all of the shortfalls of the previous two options, here it comes the kind of the ultimate option, which is basically the personalized machine learning model along with custom rules. So it's kind of hybrid model that is combining both. First of all, there is the custom rules, where an expert that wants to act specific rules, he would be able to amend it on the model itself. And in regards to the machine learning model, it's not specific to all of the transactions. However, it considers the card as if it is a profile, a user profile, along with the user that is initiating the transaction. And if the behavior of the card along with the end user that is conducting the transaction it does not make sense, then accordingly it detects right away that this is a kind of fraud. So that's how it contributes it solves the part of where it identifies, for example, all of the transactions are rejected or no. It's by having them through what's called the device fingerprinting, browser fingerprinting, or mobile fingerprinting, whereas each and every transaction that is coming from a certain there is a match in the behavior, so then it passes that transaction. If it detects that there is an issue or there is a mismatch when it comes to the behavior that the user is doing while performing the transaction and the card that is being used, so accordingly he would categorize, or the algorithm would categorize such transaction as high risky transaction, and accordingly it is so of course its advantages, it offers the most optimal accuracy detection rate, the best possible true positive and the least false positive percentage among all of the previous solutions. And of course, when it comes to the cons, it's detect the current attacks that are happening around the globe in order to take the appropriate action when, let's say, witnessing one of the IPs that has been detected by the threat intelligence feeds that it's so this is regarding the fraud, the three different fraud solutions. So how can we conclude, or what would be the key takeaways from all of this? First of all, the human will be always the weakest link inside each and every supply chain, either when it comes to the software industry or the fintech industry or any kind of industry. Still the human factor will be the weakest link when it comes to security. And the OTP from the end user, like the banks themselves are not liable by any means, since the OTP, by entering the OTP as an end user, you are you are the only one that does have the access of that OTP. Well, if the attacker managed that to get that OTP, then this is where the liability shifts from the bank to the end user itself. So definitely the customer awareness plays a very vital part in that, regardless to what extent we go into sophisticated detection solutions. So that's one. It comes to biometrics, it's very hard. It turned out that it is very hard to kind of uh, duplicate or clone the fingerprint, the user fingerprint, or the retina scan, or any of those kind of biometric authentication methods. And that's how eventually the transactions will get authenticated in the future, that there would be some kind of more shift towards that area. And last but not least, as we have seen, the some malicious solution, then accordingly he would try to kind of report that person. Likewise, for the payment processors, there are certain kind of fraud solutions, as we spoke, that are related to that layer. Likewise for the acquirer banks, likewise for the issuer banks, likewise for all of the ecosystem. So each and every one is playing a different role, yet we're geared towards the same goal, which is basically payments that exist in able to expand that number, yet in a controlled risk manner, without jeopardizing or without impacting the number of fraud that is happening around the globe. So it's kind of challenging part, yet it's interesting, and I believe that by time, like what happened with the spoofed or the clone card, the percentage decreased. Likewise, it will happen, inshallah, to the card not present over the globe. So in that, as we spoke, having the proper security measurements on the mobile devices, the fraud solutions that are very specific to the acquirers, and there are other solutions that are fraud solutions that are very specific to the issuers, and there are others that are specific to the merchant, etc. Okay, which is more secure, soft token or hard token? Well, an interesting one, because initially we all think about it as the hardware. It's the kind of the ultimate security that it offers when it comes to, let's say, OTP, etc. But it turns out it's not usually the case, because the problem is that, as we have seen in I don't recall which year, but there was an attack on RSA. That the attackers managed to get the initial vector of all of the tokens, and once having those, they managed to kind of replicate all of the RSAs, the RSA tokens that exist in the wild. So each and every thing, it does have its pros and cons. I would say that by nature we will go more on soft tokens, and definitely there would be more security involved into that part. Best case scenario from my personal perspective is that we will go soft tokens along with some biometrics that is involved. I think that would be the best kind of scenario that we would be having when it comes to kind of methods for each and every transaction. Okay, other questions? To which extent can we rely on cyber security awareness among end users and citizens to combat cyber fraud crimes? What's the recommended approach in designing cybersecurity awareness campaigns among various segments of nation? Well, that's a very interesting question as well. To be honest, it's a very challenging part, because you will need some, along with the existence of each and every product, well, the card is not a new product, but if we consider, let's say, the mobile wallets, if we consider some emerging technologies of the payments, there has to be a marketing expenditure that is involved in order to kind of making the proper awareness for the customer to secure himself. Like, for example, it could be as simple as like when the OTP is sent to the customer, it says as follows: this is the OTP, and you should not share it with anyone by, let's say, through a phone call or physical. The only way you should use that is through writing it on the website. This is an example, but again, if the website itself is kind of fraudulent merchant, like what we speak about, like the merchant fraud identity attack, so in that case, well, it doesn't avoid such situation. But the more we conduct such kind of awareness, and the more frequent exercises that we conduct, the better it is. And there is an interesting things that some phishing attack sites that do in order to kind of train the employees not to fall into the phishing attacks, is that they simulate the attack. And when they simulate the attack, they would understand who will fall in the trap scenario, and who will succeed. And in case someone fall into the trap scenario, well, in that case, he should be getting the proper training, and he should be more acquainted to the security trainings to protect his payments or the financial transactions. So back to your question. Well, First of all, there should be enough marketing expenditure on the customer awareness, and it should be frequent. And one way or another, there should be kind of simulation, or the training part should be in a kind of interactive manner, not only just through a video or so. And again, this is the kind of the optimal case or the ultimate case of this. Well, going over the well, I guess that's it then. Yeah. What is the there is another final question. What is the most aspects? Each and every one of them would have its own proper fraud mechanism. Definitely, the most commonly used is the most mature out of these is the card-based fraud transactions. However, when it comes to the other payment methods, as they are to some extent considered emerging payment methods, so there is a room for improvement and a room for learning more about the behavior of such types of frauds that happen in the other payment methods. So I guess that's it. I'm not sure if anyone else does have any other question. Feel free to kind of ask. I guess we're still having 3 more minutes. Well, I guess that's it then. Well, thank you for joining, guys, and hopefully that was beneficial. And please, if you do have any follow-up questions, happy to hear them through the chat, or this is my mail. In case you want further follow-up. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.